Well, good afternoon. For those of you that may not know me, my name is Greg Whitcup, and I am director of both Cranbrook Art Museum and the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And I thank you on behalf of many of my colleagues here at Cranbrook, including our president, Dominic DeMarco, for joining us on this Sunday afternoon. Museum directors always like it when program days have a little bit of rain because it brings out a few more people than if it was a day like yesterday. So before I introduce our speaker tonight, I just want to step back a little bit and tell you a little bit about the Michigan Modern Project and some of the other activities that are a part of it. This exhibition is something that actually started as a research project initiated by the State Historic Preservation Office. It then quickly developed into a symposium. And the 5 speakers that we have part of our series here, all were part of the symposium that kicked off the project here at Cranbrook in June. There was the exhibition, of course, which continues for another 2 weeks in the galleries here at Cranbrook, before it then travels to the other side of the state, where it will be at the Grand Rapids Art Museum next summer in a slightly different iteration with maybe a little bit more of an emphasis on West Michigan modernism. And then the final component of this will be a very substantial publication. Rather than simply a catalog of this exhibition, though, it's going to be one that is going to try to bring together all of these stories of modernism, many of them, quite frankly, that have only been emerging since we've had the exhibition on display in the galleries. But we're very proud to be partnering with the State Historic Preservation and the curators of the exhibition, Monica Ponce de Leon and her partner and husband, Gregory Saldana, in Ann Arbor, on this project here. Programmatically, there are going to be 2 more lectures in this series. Next week on October 6th, Eric Hill, who really initiated the research of this whole project, a professor of architecture at the University of Michigan, he will be speaking here. And then on the final weekend, October 13th, Dale Geyer, who is a professor of architecture at Lawrence Technological University, will be talking about the life and career of Minoru Yamasaki. That is actually going to be followed by, a quick public service announcement here by a fundraiser that we are holding at the home of Minoru Yamasaki, which is owned by Linda Charfus. If anybody is interested in joining us there after this lecture and buying a ticket for that event, which will have not only the current homeowner who has lovingly restored the house, but then also Dale Geyer will be there, as well as one of Yamasaki's founding partners, Henry Guthard, will be there, as well as then the son of the contractor that built the house. I mean, even if you have been to this house before, this will be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really learn about one of these gems of Michigan modernism. In between, we have a couple of tours going on. Next weekend on Saturday, Leslie Edwards, who is the head archivist at Cranbrook, will be presenting a walking and bus tour of the gates of Cranbrook. And then, if October 13th wasn't full enough already, through the Center for Collections and Research, we are once again opening up the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House in Bloomfield Hills to tours. So many opportunities to take advantage of Michigan modernism before the exhibition closes on October 13th. Today, however, we're here to hear Rip Rapson speak, and I had the pleasure of hearing him speak at the symposium, and this is going to be a real treat for you. I think for most of us, we know Rip Rapson as the president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation, an attorney and expert in urban policy by education and training. Rip assumed leadership of the $3 billion Kresge Foundation in 2006 and quickly initiated a multi-year transition to expand and recalibrate the foundation's grant-making programs, including a major commitment to assuming a leading role in the revitalization of Detroit through, among other programs, the Kresge Arts in Detroit Awards program. Prior to joining Kresge, Rip was president of the McKnight Foundation in Minneapolis, a senior fellow at the University of Minnesota, and before joining the university faculty, he even served for 4 years as deputy mayor of Minneapolis, where he was the architect of the Minneapolis Neighborhood Revitalization Plan. Rip received his law degree from Columbia Law School. It is an impressive resume indeed, but today he is wearing a much humbler hat, lecturing to us as the son of one of the nation's pioneering modernist architects and graduates of Cranbrook Academy of Art, Ralph Rapson. Not only does this lecture mark the inclusion of work by Ralph Rapson in Michigan Modern, including that great rocker at the front of the exhibition, but more important for all of us, not only here at Cranbrook, to scholars and architects and designers around the world, it also celebrates the donation by Rip and his family to Cranbrook Archives, the Ralph Rapson Papers. After the lecture is over, we warmly invite you to the public unveiling of this important collection in the Archives reading room on the lower level of the Art Museum. So please join me in welcoming to Cranbrook, where I should also add Rip and his wife Gail are parents of 2 Cranbrook school students, Rip Rapson.
Thank you, Greg. That was very kind. Dom, thank you. It's always such a pleasure and honor to be on the Cranbrook campus, and to have the head of the whole deal here is a very special thing indeed. Greg, I think what you've done with the exhibit and with the emerging programming around the archives is just spectacular, so thank you for that. I also do want to do a special thank you to a couple of people who will have taken most of the responsibility for the slides you'll see this afternoon. First is my assistant Sharon Zimmerman at Kresge, but Sharon is a passionate connoisseur of art of all kinds and architecture, and she was able to help me figure this out. And second is Leslie Edwards, who tried to match up some of the slides I was using with some of the slides that we actually have in the Cranbrook collection now to enhance it. So before I begin, let me just offer one really important disclaimer. The design gene pool in our family decidedly moved to one side of the family and not to mine. It moved directly into the heartbeat of my brother Toby, who is here today. Toby practiced with my father for the better part of a quarter of a century. Has some of my father's extraordinary drafting hand and has his own practice now in his own right. So I've asked him not to interrupt me with corrections, but I've also assured him that any questions that you might have, I will direct exactly toward him. So Toby and his family are here, so thanks, Tobe, for coming along, and good luck. So let me, what I'm going to try to do this afternoon is trace my father's career, essentially from his time at Cranbrook through the next 60 years. So 60 years, a little less than 60 minutes. I don't think I will take that long, but hang on. A lot of images, a lot of activities. I used to tell my father, and he just hated it, that he was sort of the Forrest Gump of modern architecture, that those of you who don't know the movie, this character kind of tracks all of the major developments of the 20th century. And when you look at the connections and the experiences that my father had during the course of his exposure to Corbusier, Mies, Saarinen, Alto, the whole crew, it bears some resemblance. But it was more than Forrest Gump, actually. It was that he participated in a meaningful way in the formative events of 20th century modernism. And what I'd like to do is sort of think about the talk in sort of three pieces. One, I'm going to talk a little bit about his Michigan roots and the path that sort of led him to Cranbrook. Two, talk a little bit about the environment at Cranbrook. And three, I'd like to then stretch out beyond his time at Cranbrook to demonstrate that the enduring influence of Cranbrook on all of his subsequent work was extraordinarily powerful. So let's start at the beginning. Dad was born in 1914 in Alma, Michigan. He is the one seated on your right. He had some kind of deformity at birth that caused the doctors to conclude that he needed to be amputated. If you look on his right arm, if you look very carefully, you can actually see at the bottom of his right cuff there is no hand. And because in many ways he couldn't handle multiple media and work with both hands in a sort of a facile way, at least his interpretation of his drawing skill was that he was forced to draw from a very early age. And he drew, and he drew, and he drew. His first real exposure in high school was in a shop class. I think he did this in 11th grade, if you can imagine. And everybody else, I was looking through the files, everybody else did sort of nice, simple, neatly lettered covers. So Prometheus here was Dad's way of sort of exercising his artistic need for artistic expression through a shop class. And at the same time, he just began to read anything that wouldn't move. He read Louis Kahn's Kindergarten Chats. He actually sought out Alden Dow for an apprenticeship in high school. Dow turned him down. It was a deeply scarring experience, but he lived through it. And then after these sort of years in high school, trying to sort of dabble at art through other means, he enrolled in Alma College, where he sort of put together a makeshift architectural studies, and from there he went to the University of Michigan on a 2-year scholarship. This was an interesting time at Michigan. He was there under Dean Lorch. It was largely sort of a mainstream Beaux-Arts kind of curriculum that was quite common in the 30s. Modernism really hadn't hit American architectural education, but there were some stirrings of modernism at Michigan that attracted Dad. There were a number of young faculty who were interested not just in reproducing historical forms, but in design approaches that reflected this sort of dizzying change abreast in the world in materials and the social realities of the 1930s and the technologies of the modern machine age. So Dad, again, sort of created an independent path through the University of Michigan, again with a heavy dose of drawing, but all of a sudden now with outlets for his architecture. During his senior year, for example, he entered an architectural forum competition and submitted something called the 416 House. This is about 1938, and essentially a very simple construct. It was just standardized dimensional materials and techniques. But for a college kid trying to experiment with modernism, it was reasonably impressive. He didn't win the competition, but he did get an honorable mention together with $50. So that was sort of his first exposure into sort of modernist expression. And I think he had gotten enough of a taste, so he then wrote a letter to a reasonably well-known architect of the period named Frank Lloyd Wright, asking if he might come and spend some time at Taliesin. He and 3 other potential apprentices were accepted into the program, and what it involved is sort of a week-long stay at Taliesin with sort of a final sort of cross-examination by Wright just to make sure that everything was falling in place. Dad tells a very funny set of stories about this week. I mean, he followed Wright around. He watched him brush his teeth. He watched him draft. He watched him, well, I won't go there. He watched him do a lot of things. And one of the funny stories he tells is when one day Wright took these apprentices up to the sort of the top of the hill and began sort of lecturing, and Wright always had this cape and sort of the wind was blowing through his hair. It looked like sort of a Hollywood thing. And as he reached up, a bird landed on his cuff. And this is Dad's attempt to demonstrate the moment right before the bird on the tree is lighting down. But the real point of this story is that at the end of the 7 days, Dad got the 3 apprentice aspirants sort of in the room at a very formal dinner. This was one of those string evenings that you've probably heard about that Wright would occasionally have, everyone dressed up. And he sat the three in the middle of the room, and he began asking them questions. And it kind of got more hostile and more hostile. And it was very clear that what Wright was trying to do was make the point that American architectural education, of which Wright had never had any, he had apprenticed with Louis Sullivan, was inadequate. And he just kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and these poor kids got more and more uncomfortable. So Dad gets up and says, "Thank you very much, Mr. Wright. I've really appreciated your hospitality," and walks out. Of course, everyone's jaw drops. But so much for his apprenticeship at Taliesin. That was the end of that. But when he came back to Michigan, he was encouraged to apply for something called the Booth Traveling Fellowship. And I think Tom Booth, Tom, are you here? Did I see you somewhere? Tom, one of the members of the family, and of course many of you probably do know that the Booths were just so instrumental in the creation of Cranbrook. And what the Booth Traveling Fellowship provided was a full graduate scholarship, essentially to a program of one's choice. This is the drawing Dad submitted, one of his most traditional but I think most lovely drawings. He didn't win, but the elder Saarinen, Eliel Saarinen, was the judge. And Saarinen was so taken by this drawing that he called Dad and said, I can't give you the prize, but I can give you a scholarship to Cranbrook. And if you'd come and do graduate work at Cranbrook in architecture and urban planning, I'd love to have you. So Dad jumped at the chance. And of course, this was 1938, and the class that Dad joined was truly, truly extraordinary. It was Eames, Weiss, Ben Baldwin, the whole group, and others. Dad arrived really early. He was evidently scheduled to arrive 2 or 3 weeks later than he did, but he arrived early so he could get a room right next to the elder Saarinen, a choice studio right next to what they believed would be the place where most of the work would be done. And Saarinen thought of Dad mostly as planning material. He was working at that point on the master plan for Lansing, the state capital at Lansing. And he put Dad to work doing traffic studies and circulation studies and just stuff that was not particularly exciting, but Dad did it. And it sort of finally came to fruition where Dad was really excited. He had done all these studies. He brought in all these drawings, brought in all these statistics, laid them out in front of Pappy, and Pappy, without saying a word, sort of looked at them, took his cane, and swept them all off the table. And Dad realized he was not exactly planning material. But Pappy then went ahead and drew his own plans and his own studies. But it was in many ways sort of an invitation for Dad to go back and do what he really wanted to do, which was architecture. And so he hooked up closely with the Saarinen and Saarinen Architectural Office. And he worked on a number of successful competitions that were driven by Pappy early on, the Goucher and Wheaton College buildings. He was doing designing, drawing, model building, and most importantly, he was watching the elder Saarinen work. And I asked Dad once about his reaction to the elder Saarinen, whose style was very conservative, actually, by Dad's standards. It wasn't particularly modernistic. And he said that he thought he was the finest architectural craftsman he had ever watched work. He said his attention to detail, his carefulness of conceptualization, his ability to proportion properly was one of the great lessons he learned in his life. But now, sort of freed from the planning regimen, Dad sort of immediately threw himself into Cranbrook's dominant curriculum of establishing a link between the traditional craftsmanship of the old school and the new philosophies and aesthetics of the modern age. He worked in the architectural studios, to be sure, but almost like almost all people at Cranbrook, he began working in every possible discipline. And that was largely because of Saarinen's belief that an exposure to a range of disciplines was at the heart of the creative process. So Dad touched really every conceivable discipline. He he had terrific faculty to work under. Marge Grotel in ceramics. These are all from the time. He did metalworking with Henry Bertoia. I did drawing and painting with Wallace Mitchell. He did sculpture with Carl Miles. And for Dad, furniture was of particular interest from a very early age. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. But these disciplines just sort of combined and ricocheted around Cranbrook in a really powerful way, as you can see with Eames, with my father, with almost anyone who was at Cranbrook at the time. They were doing all of these things simultaneously. One example was that evidently Bertoia was trying to do some sort of cross-discipline work between music and painting and sculpture. And so one night, Dad gets woken up in the middle of the night with this huge pounding, heavy pounding. He walks down the hall and says to Bertoia, what are you doing? And it's like 2 a.m. And evidently what Bertoia was doing was he had a series of prints. And he actually had the prints, you would sort of scroll through the prints according to sort of this heavy, rhythmic, syncopated pattern, pound, 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 and you would turn the pages at the pace that the rhythm would drive. And so Dad said, "Would you please stop? It's 2 a.m." And Bertoia said, "Okay, I'll stop." So Dad goes back, goes to sleep. Next night, same thing, goes down the hall again. He said, "Well, I had a new rhythm. I wanted to try a new rhythm." Dad said, all right. So it stops. Next night, same thing. This goes on for like a week, and finally Dad just gave up and got earplugs. But it was a great example of how all of these disciplines sort of collided and reformed. But, at the end of the day, architecture really was primary for my father, and he came to engage rather fully with the Saarinen office. And in particular, he formed a close bond with Eero in the middle, who had come to Cranbrook in 1936 and who was essentially directing his father's office. The interesting thing about Eero at this point was that he was just a complete workaholic. And Dad and he just became fast friends. They would stay up in the mornings till 2 a.m. and then go out for beers afterward. But Dad was much more social than Eero was, and more than a bit mischievous. And so it was beginning to sort of annoy Eero, because Dad every Friday afternoon would organize the entire office, take them outside for these touch football games, and these would go on for hours. Just drove Eero nuts. He was a workaholic. They had work to do, and Dad's out playing touch football. That's Dad on the left, on your right, obviously. And so finally, Dad was not a big man, but he was actually quite a good athlete. And so finally, he goes up, and Saarinen's yelling at him, and Dad says, "Oh, come on!" And he just picks Saarinen up. He just picks him up, walks him down to the football field, and teaches him how to play, because Saarinen didn't have a clue about how to play football. But Saarinen was so competitive that he completely got into it. And even though he had absolutely no talent, he insisted on being the quarterback. And for the next couple of years, he was the one who ended up organizing the football games. You couldn't keep Saarinen off the football field. The second sort of memorable act of mischievousness that I thought you might get a kick out of is that when Saarinen was scheduled to be married to Lily Swan on the Cranbrook campus, Lily was a weaver. Dad organized sort of this group of folks from Cranbrook, and they went up to the room where Lily and Eero would spend their first night as a married couple with saws, and they sawed through about 3/4 of the way through the posts of the bed. Came down, and sort of after the reception, he got about, I don't know, he tells it 30 people, who knows how many people, underneath one of the trees, right underneath the room. And so Lily and Eero come walking down, and they walk up the stairs, and then the lights go out, and about 2 minutes later, there's this huge crash, just huge crash. And there was just no question in Saarinen's mind who was responsible for this. So he throws open the windows and says, "Damn you, Rapson," but forgave him the next day. So they ended up being just great friends. Back to the architecture. So Dad was fascinated by how different materials could be incorporated into new building forms. And this is the 1939 Fabric House. This was published nationally in a couple of different publications. And it's one of the first examples of using mass-produced fabric for structural enclosures. It called for insulated fabric rolls that were wrapped around internal telescoping structural poles, so you could actually adjust to alter the interior space. Really, I think just a fabulous kind of creative act. He could make it go up, he could make it go down, he could go wider, and it really was one of the first of its kind. And similarly, he did something called the cave house, sort of a second example of putting the recent technological innovation to practical use. This was also published extensively, and one of the earliest explorations of earth shelter housing. And this wasn't just an abstraction. This actually got built for the Hagbergs, and it worked very well. Dad said that they actually never got complaints about leakage or didn't cave in. No one was killed. I mean, it seemed to work fine. Largely because of his engineer friend, David Runnels, who solved for all of the complexities of moisture and pressure on the walls. He actually developed something called earth ramming to ensure structural stability that evidently was used in many structures going forward. And this is one of the typical sorts of drawings that Dad was doing at the time. I mean, the idea of putting people in these drawings was very, very unusual. As I was going back through the files of competitions, I'll talk about in just a moment, competitions of the period, nobody did this. Everyone was sort of drawing an elevation. I mean, it was just sort of standard. But what Dad wanted to try to do was to tell a story and to sort of humanize the design. And also, I think he just couldn't help himself. It just sort of reflected his sense of mischievousness and humor. And you'll see as we go through lots of examples of sort of quirky people doing quirky things. Matter of fact, one of the drawings that we were thinking about using for the cover of the book I did on my father was just a beautiful drawing, and I realized I couldn't use it because he had a little kid with a gun pointed at his mother. And I thought, probably not. A third application of his desire to use materials in an innovative way came through two different competitions. The first was this Owings, Illinois glass block competition. And there were a series of competitions in this pre-war era when not a lot was being built. And people wanted to try new technologies, and there were actually points that were allocated to the winners of these competitions. And Dad did 4 or 5 of them, won a bunch of them, and this was one. The glass block competition was one. A second was a company that wanted to do the storefronts of tomorrow to try to figure out how you could use metal in creating storefronts. He won this one as well. Actually, on this one, this is an interesting competition. Mies van der Rohe was one of the jurors, and I found in the competition file this little juror's comment sheet, and Mies said of Dad's submission, he said, "This is not just competent, but brilliant." So he was clearly getting people's attention. The final example of this sort of use of innovative use of materials and construction techniques was something called the Demountable Space Project. In 1940, the gypsum company approached Eero Saarinen because they wanted to try to figure out how to use their materials and building products in a structure that could be readily taken up and put up and taken down. But about the same time it came into Eero was being called to DC, and so Dad took over. And it was heavily influenced by a concept that Bucky Fuller developed, which is almost like a circus tent. It was a sort of suspended construction where the central column was a structural chimney that could also serve as an erection crane for standardized prefabricated floor and room panels, wall frames, and window sections. So this actually would kind of bend in and out. And so it was quite an extraordinary piece. These competitions in the pre-World War II era really did give architects a platform to demonstrate new concepts at a time when the war's call on materials and finances meant that very few buildings were being built. Probably the most important competition to come across the Saarinen office's desk was the 1939 William and Mary competition, College of William and Mary. It called for the design of a performing arts center at William and Mary, right in the heart of historical Williamsburg, and it was significant in that it was going to be the first in the launch of 6 regional theaters across the country. The elder Saarinen chose not to enter, and Dad decided that he would. There were about 600 submissions, and again, looking through this file was just fascinating. Gropius, Breuer, Edward Durrell Stone, Neutra, I mean, all of the greats of the time entered. And Eero joined Dad sort of halfway through this and helped a lot with the interior design, but the exterior was largely Dad's hand, as you can see in many of these drawings. The upshot of all of this is that Dad won, and it was a very big deal. It toured the United States for 2 years under the auspices of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the publicity it generated and the exposure it generated contributed to a growing public awareness of modern architecture. Again, we're in 1939, and the things that we take for granted now just weren't in active play. And I think in its distinctively modern idiom, it was a profound influence on helping American colleges and universities sort of break out from their more traditional campus architectural and planning styles in thinking about new buildings. That's the final model as built. So in 1939, the Saarinen office sent Dad to Chicago, and this proved to be a powerful turning point in his career. He went out one night with a friend, and they were sitting in a bar and noticed a guy across the way, and everyone was sort of coming and talking to him, and Dad said, "Who's that?" And his friend said, "I don't know, let's go find out." So they went over and talked to him, and it was a guy named Laszlo MoholyNagy. And MoholyNagy had been with the German Bauhaus and had brought the Bauhaus to America, and particularly to Chicago. It was a fairly small operation at the time, but took Dad around, tried to convince him to come, but Dad still had work to do with the Saarinen office, but left a deep impression on him. He really was profoundly taken with MoholyNagy's sort of genius and artistic sensibility. And so after he completed his scholarship at Cranbrook, his fellowship at Cranbrook in 1940, he actually would return to Chicago and ultimately end up heading the architecture department at the new Bauhaus, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But the time in Chicago became a time of continuing experimentation in both furniture and housing, and so I wanted to start a little bit with the furniture. Obviously when he was at Cranbrook, he had some of the great furniture designers of American history to talk with and to work with, Eames and Bertoia and Saarinen and others, hundreds. They did hundreds and hundreds of design, but it actually took another Cranbrook student to move his designs from paper into production, and that was Florence Schust. Schust had been at Cranbrook. Those of you who took the tour with Greg heard a little bit about her, and she ended up marrying Hans Knoll, who had a furniture company and who had started Knoll Furniture in New York in 1938. When Knoll started his line of furniture in 1941, his first full line of modern furniture in 1941, he was really on a mission. He really believed that post-war America would be a time of change and one that would be much more conducive to putting modern furniture within the reach of many American families and businesses. So Knoll invited Dad, because Schust had been really taken with Dad's work, to present his ideas for a new line called Equipment for Living. And Dad produced a couple of drawings that looked like this, and Knoll was really taken with it. He immediately commissioned my father to create the Rapson metal line that would be suitable for indoor or outdoor use. And this relationship ended up growing and growing with Dad designing for Knoll until 1949 when Dad left for Europe. This is an interesting one. For those of architectural aficionados among you, does that look like anybody's chair that has been wildly popular? Frank Gehry, right? 1939, Gehry's was in the 60s. I've often asked Dad if he bugged Gehry for royalties, but Gehry refused to admit that he'd even seen the chair. Probably right, but it's a funny coincidence. But whole series of designs, Sharon, you can probably scroll through some of these. This is of course the rocker on the top that is at the front of the show. I think, Toby, if I'm right, this is the one that Mom gave to the Museum of Modern Art that Dad was so annoyed that she gave away. Yeah, probably. Yeah, but at any rate. These, again, were all done for Knoll in one way or another. So the relationship with Knoll and Dad probably hit its high point in 1944 when Knoll asked Dad to create the Rapson line of 12 different chairs. And there were certain characteristics of these lines, of the line and the designs for the line. One was they were affordable. They were not very expensive. Two, they always utilized new materials and fabrication techniques. And three, they were always sort of pushing the boundaries of new forms. One of the interesting things that Knoll did was to hire the legendary graphic designer Alvin Lustig to promote these lines in newspapers all across the country. So this Rapson line, actually got a lot of exposure. But it was probably the Rapson Rapid Rocker that gathered the most attention. This is an interesting one. This, for those of you who have seen the other Rapson Rocker, you'll notice that it's bentwood. It's much more flowing. But this was actually produced during wartime restrictions when you couldn't use pieces of wood longer than 18 inches. Everything else was being requisitioned for the war effort. So this is the sort of the slightly blockier thing. I don't know, Toby, are these still in, are the short stick versions still in production, or are they all the bentwood ones? These as well, huh? Interesting, good. But the entire line was purchased by Bloomingdale's, all 12 pieces of furniture, and featured in a big show, which was really the nation's first department store showing of modern furniture. And in this review, I'm sure you can read it on the left, Alda Louise Huxtable, the great architectural critic of the New York Times, basically says in the first paragraph that the rocker steals the show, and it really did. It became very popular. And Dad would continue designing the rocker over the years, but it fell out of production, and now Toby has reintroduced it of late. Dad would continue designing furniture throughout his career. One of the great stories of his later years, and Dad passed when he was about 93, is that he and Toby entered a competition for Blue Dot magazine. Was it Dwell magazine or Blue Dot magazine? One of the Blue Dot magazine, and they threw it open to all of the great young aspiring 19, 24-year-old architects, and they came down to 3 finalists, and then they did a big vote, and Dad, at age 92, won the Blue Dot competition for design. I'm sure the young designers were really annoyed, but here's some of his most whimsical designs. Is the double R. One of Dad's fascinations was what happens when you put 2 people in a chair. You'll see a lot of that. This is one. This is my favorite chair. It's called the Chair of Tomorrow. It never really, I don't think it ever went into production. I think there was a plan to put it in production, and it fell through. I don't know why. It's a great one, as you'll see in the next slide. Yeah. Knowing Dad, that's exactly how he wanted it used, too. And then this final one. For those of you who can see, that's a fly on that man's head. He just couldn't help himself. He couldn't do it straight. But the other thing that is so phenomenal, and again, people in the audience are probably much better equipped to talk about this, is this technique of viewing things from different angles. Again, it's not in section. I mean, he comes from the top, he comes from the side, he comes from underneath, and it was just one of those skills that he had. He rarely drew over. I mean, these were usually freehand. Whether this one was, I don't know. But having watched him all those years, I mean, it was just stunning. He would produce one of these in no time at all. So his love of furniture and the designed object led him many years later in 1950, by which time he had moved to Boston, to create a store that would be dedicated to modernism. It was called Rapson Inc. And it just called on objects and furniture and fabric work created by designers and architects. It was located on Copley Square in Boston. And you'll see as we scroll through, he mostly just got on the phone to his friends. He got Saarinen and Bertoya and the whole crew. And it had everything from chairs to case goods to sofas, I think, is next. It was really quite an extraordinary store. This is a picture of the layout, and if we had more time, I would test you on whose furniture is who. But he gives you the answers on the bottom. It's quite a collection of the great architectural furniture designers of the second half of the 20th century. Here's another room. These chairs literally were on the wall, but you can see. Of course, the womb chair, and then there's the rocker in the forefront, and Mary Mecco and all sorts of other folks gathered in one place. It's so funny. When we were growing up in our house in Minneapolis, those drapes were on our windows, and I could never figure out why they had such crummy drapes. I just thought, why would you hang such sort of uninteresting drapes? Until I found out that, of course, these are fabrics done by some of the premier designers of America. We also had these little side tables, and I would sit on them and jump on them, and those were, of course, the Saarinen side tables. I mean, we just abused all of these masterpieces of modern design. Mom and Dad ran this store, mostly Mom, actually, for almost 5 years until they did a stint in Europe, I'll talk about in just a second, that caused them to break away. But it really did pave the way for furniture stores of this kind. I'm not aware of any other furniture store in 1950 that had done this, but 3 years later, Ben Thompson's Design Research opened, which became sort of the standard for that kind of store. So let me do a quick check back to the MoholyNagy period, just because MoholyNagy and Dad did tens and tens of joint commercial projects in the 1941 to 1945 period. MoholyNagy was really much more interested in making money. And so as a result, this is one, the U.S. Gypsum storefront. Maybe, Sharon, can you go back? I mean, just to sort of check against, so that's the drawing, and this is sort of as built. It lost a little bit in the translation, but it was, again, this sort of idea of trying to present to the public in the sort of modernistic idiom, which was very unusual at the time. This just did not look like Macy's department store. But then comes my very favorite project that was never built, unfortunately, which was the B&O Railroad Commission. They came to MoholyNagy and wanted a whole sort of redesign of the B&O Railroad. They wanted new station, they wanted new ticket counters, they wanted a Vista Dome, which didn't exist at that point. And so MoholyNagy couldn't draw. So he and Dad would talk for hours and hours and hours, and then Dad would go and create these drawings. And again, I'm told by people who know how to draw that vanishing perspective point is about as hard a thing to draw as you can draw. And Dad has a whole suite of these. It's sleeping cars. He had the Vista Dome, restaurant cars. They were never built, but it's sort of prescient how they look in many ways. But in addition to furniture and railroad cars and commercial competitions, when he was in Chicago, he also was teaching at the new Bauhaus and designing with MoholyNagy. Dad did a number of residential design projects as well. This is something called the Gidwitz House in Chicago. I think it still stands. It's done in about 1946. I think there's a second view of it. And increasingly, he was being called upon, particularly after those sort of pre-war and during the war competitions, to design low-cost housing that would be suitable for the post-war housing boom that everyone predicted when the soldiers came back. And taken together, these small-scale residential designs that Dad produced during Chicago constitute a strong composite image of what modest, affordable housing might look like in the post-war years. And again, he did some competitions. I think the next slide is of a competition that Popular Homes did. This was actually built. That looks pretty grim there, but the house itself was much better, actually, as built. So, yeah, and then he did the Wheaton House. Blueprint for Tomorrow competition. Oh, that's still the Wheaton House. Blueprint for Tomorrow competition, which he also won. And Dad's designs were increasingly being recognized as important in multiple venues. And it was best reflected, perhaps, in the launch of what was called the Case Study House Program in 1945 by a man named John Intenza, who was the editor of Art and Architecture magazine. Intenza chose 9 architects, Eames, Neutra, Saarinen, Dad, and 4 others. And Saarinen and Dad were the only 2 non-California architects. And what Intenza wanted to do was essentially create an R&D program for post-war housing. It ended up extending into the 60s. I think they ended up doing 36, 38 prototypes. But they gave each architect the choice of where to build and how, and everybody else sort of built on the cliffs of Malibu. Dad chose to put his in Watts in South Central LA, and to try to figure out how to bring some element of nature and life into the house itself. And he did it through something called the Greenbelt House, and a whole series of studies for that house that you can see in the next couple of slides. That's a little bit hard to read, but again, you have people playing badminton. I think this is the first appearance of the helicopter, is it not? I don't know. Did we see a helicopter in any of the other slides? Yeah, you did? So this became one of Dad's signature elements. He was just convinced that in post-war America, the helicopter would be the dominant form of transportation. And so most of his drawings for the case study house had the hovering helicopter. The next slide, I think, is sort of typical of where he's essentially sort of showing people, gardening, sunbathing, tricycling around, just giving the sense of some ways in which the house could be used. I love the woman with the sunglasses. Very cool. When you think about it, why would you put sunglasses on a woman sitting in the house? I mean, it just, it was just so idiosyncratic. It's just great. And then I think there's someone gardening in the middle of the house, in the middle of the Greenbelt house. And this culminates, this series of drawings, case study house number 4, culminates in what well may be his iconic drawing. Cesar Pelli, great architect, once told me at a dinner that he believed this drawing revolutionized architectural drafting in 20th century America. He said the use of perspective, the helicopter, although again, Aldo Luis Huxtable, the architectural critic, took another swipe at Dad at this one and said, great house, innovative, cutting edge, the future, but why does he keep betting on the wrong technology? So rather than washing machines, we've got clothes hanging on the line, and rather than cars, he's got the Dad coming home in the helicopter. But he always had his Jeep. He loved Jeeps. Dad didn't drive, because of one arm, but he was infatuated with Jeeps, and so a lot of these would have Jeeps in them. At the war's conclusion, Dad continued to try to imagine the future through these competitions. He entered some residential competitions. He won a great many, including this one for the National Association of Home Builders, but others he didn't win. He did try. He was convinced that his design was better than Eero's. They were always competitive. I think the next slide shows the one he actually ended up submitting in some form with the Mississippi River running through it in the middle. He also went back to his planning roots and entered a number of competitions for city planning. This is one in 1946 to imagine sort of post-war Chicago. He did this with Kevin Lynch, who was his roommate when he was in Boston, one of the great planners of American planning history. And what's, I think, so interesting, and maybe doesn't seem striking now, but was striking then, was the envisionment of a high-density urban core, something that we've come to expect now, but I think, as Dad explained it, at that point, it made a lot of the jurors very nervous. They wanted much more a Brasilia kind of open plan, and he and Kevin really emphasized issues of street life and density. And he even planned embassies. This is a great competition to design the embassy in Ecuador. Never came to fruition. But after the war, Dad did move from Chicago. MoholyNagy had asked him to stay and take over the new Bauhaus for a number of reasons. Dad chose not to. He was recruited to MIT by William Webster, a great architect who began in Cambridge and then ended up in California. And then his whole world got turned upside down. He designed 3 or 4 years with a team of architects at MIT, but then he got a call from Hans Knoll, and Knoll basically said the United States really wants to design a new set of new embassies that would sort of project forward in Europe a very different image of America. Up until then, a lot of the embassies were housed in traditional sort of Victorian structures, and this was an attempt to do a very different kind of presence. And he was hired essentially on the spot to do 4. The first is Stockholm, which sits on this wonderful site. I've not been here, but I've talked to folks who have, and they said it still looks pretty much as is, although as with so many of the embassies, they're now surrounded by sort of bunker security gates and structures. The second was Copenhagen. And Kimberly Peterson, Bruce, who was the chair of the board of Cranbrook, spent time in this embassy, did he not? 2 years in this embassy. I actually think it's a great embassy, but again, it probably has all sorts of bunkers. It works okay? Oh, yeah. I'll pretend I didn't hear that. It's a great building. And then he designed and had built a whole series of staff apartments and consulates for the Foreign Service throughout Europe. Here's housing in France, a model for some consulate housing, again in France. Many of these were realized. The Hague, Netherlands. And then there were a number of embassies he was working on that were never realized. First, this is a consulate, but this was in Bremen, Germany. This was not built. And a real shame was the embassy in Oslo, which was, I think, one of his more interesting and innovative structures. This was also not built. But the killer was Athens. Dad went into working drawings on this. I mean, they were into construction drawings. They were, if you can go back here, Sharon. They were ready to build. And about that time, the American elections had changed the president. President Eisenhower came in. They put a stop on all the international building programs. And for one reason or another, they decided to create a different slate of architects. So one day, Dad gets a call and answers it, and hi, Ralph, it's Mies. Hi, Mies. And he said, I've got the project in Athens. Would you be willing to send your drawings over? It was a different time, so Dad said, sure, yeah, I'll send you the drawings. And evidently, you can't quite tell from this, but the way Dad describes it was a very tight space, and so the options were quite limited. And again, this was in working drawing stage. And the way Dad tells it, a little bit apocryphal perhaps, but the way Dad tells it is that what Mies built is essentially indistinguishable from what Dad built. which would make sense. He had the working drawings, might as well go with it. But it was a different time, and Dad didn't seem to resent it too much. I think there's a couple more. So Beirut didn't get built well along. One of the things you probably can't read over on the lower left is the headline, which is the modernistic embassy in Denmark is a sensation. It's hard to remember now or imagine now how structures that seem relatively conservative were just completely breaking out of the mold. And I think this embassy in particular really did create a sensation. So with the changes at the State Department, Dad returned back to Boston, and he was then recruited almost immediately to come to the University of Minnesota to serve as their dean, where he would preside for 30 years, so almost 2 full generations of Minnesota architects trained under him. And we could talk all afternoon about his architectural educational legacy, and in many ways I think he was most proud of the fact that he had touched so many people through his educational mission. But what he did bring to the University of Minnesota, and the reason I mention it, is this very strong Cranbrook emphasis on interdisciplinary work. He often would talk about how it is important to have all of the creative disciplines contribute to an architectural education, and he pursued it with a passion. He also took great pride in bringing in guest faculty, and so I just wanted to quickly mention 2 sort of funny stories, because in 1956, he thought, wouldn't it be great if the first lecturer at the University of Minnesota under his tutelage would be Frank Lloyd Wright. This is the guy he walked out on, right? So he gets on the phone, gets Wright on the phone, and he says, "Mr. Wright?" And he said, "Yeah, this is Ralph Rapson. Do you remember me?" Silence at the other end. He said, "Yes, on September 8th, 1938, you walked out on me." And he said, "What do you want?" And he said, "Well, I'd like you to come to the University of Minnesota and give some lectures." Can't believe he asked. But Wright agreed. And so Wright came, gave lectures. One of my favorite stories is Dad's driving Wright around 1956 Minneapolis, where you could still see farmland from downtown. And he said, "So, Mr. Wright, what do you think of the architecture?" And Wright kind of grimaces and says, "Makes my gums hurt." He was not much of a fan of Minneapolis's architecture of the 1950s. The second guest lecturer he had come about 5 or 6 years later is Bucky Fuller. And Fuller came for a 3-year stint, and his great project was something called Mini Earth. And this was actually almost an early computer. You can't see it here. This is sort of a prototype. But when it was built, you could actually pull out drawers from different sections of the globe, and it would tell you what the water currents were, the temperature, all of this stuff. And so Dad thought that was pretty cool, and he worked with the architect students to get that done. And the next year, Fuller thought he should maybe go a little bit bigger, so he actually expanded Mini Earth, and now all of a sudden it took over the entire architectural courtyard of the architecture building. Still okay, that Dad I thought was okay. And then Dad goes on sabbatical, big mistake. So he goes on sabbatical, we all go off to 3 months in Mexico. And President Wilson of the, Woodrow Wilson, president of the University of Minnesota, calls Dad in Meridian, Mexico or somewhere, and says, "Ralph, you got to get back here." And he says, "Why?" He said, "Everything is good." I mean, he said, "No, Fuller is trying to dome the mall of the University of Minnesota." He literally was having students erecting scaffolding, this like half-mile long mall, and he was going to build a mini Earth over the entire mall. So Dad didn't go back, but I think the project got called off. But Fuller was a character. And Dad combined this architectural administration function with a thriving architectural practice, which was very unusual at the time. At the time, you were either an architectural educator or you were a practitioner, not both. And Dad was really one of the first to sort of break through that barrier. And he filled his faculty with folks who did the same. And again, it was a sort of a clear traceback, it seems to me, to the Cranbrook philosophy of doing and thinking and teaching. And let me just say just a very short couple of words about his architectural legacy, because again, that's a whole different talk. But first and foremost was his housing. There were just scores of award-winning, very modest, very affordable homes. This was a little less affordable. This was for the Brooks family, in Timber Baron family, a beautiful, one of the few times Dad essentially acquiesced to a client's desire to design in a particular vernacular. She desperately wanted sort of a Japanese motif, and it was actually one of his most beautiful pieces of work, and ended up being quite extraordinary. But then probably even less affordable, unfortunately, is the Pillsbury house, which he did for the Pillsbury families, but really a sublime piece of work. This was done in modules. It was very complex, and it was maintained by the Pillsbury family in pristine form even after they moved. A couple of them aged, and the patriarch passed away. This is actually how it looked at the very end. And one of the stories I won't bore you with essentially is that a head of a local bank decided that he wanted that property and was going to tear this thing down. And I got into a very public argument with him about the fact that this was in pristine condition. If you want to build a McMansion, go down the road and build it. And he said, no, I own it. I'm going to tear it down. And sure enough, he did. It was a real shame. It was a beautiful house. I think it was Dad's most beautiful house. But Dad also, ironically, for a guy who didn't get into church much, did a whole series of churches, probably 6 or 7 of them. This is the Hope Lutheran Church in southern Minneapolis. Another, I don't think this is Dad's drawing, but this is another one of his churches, St. Thomas. And then St. Peter's in Edina, Minnesota. Lovely, simple. And again, a little bit like his homes, these were very simple, very elegant. These were not, and generally relatively low budget. And then there were the theaters. And let me just close with just a couple of comments about the theaters, because his most famous and perhaps his signature work of all of his oeuvre was the Tyrone Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis. That's Sir Tyrone. Guthrie was the greatest, for those of you who don't know, Guthrie was the greatest Shakespearean director of his time. He had worked in Stratford, and he was used to working in a very traditional, conventional setting. Stratford looks a lot like the Globe Theater. And the battles that he and Dad had were just extraordinary. And let's stick on that slide for just a moment, Sharon. Because one of the first fights was it should look just like the Globe. Well, not exactly. He also felt that people shouldn't sit in padded seats. If planks were good enough for the Globe, they should be good enough for the Guthrie. I'll tell you a story about that in just a moment. And the other thing is he insisted that people kind of be uncomfortable in theater. And so there was going to be like 31 inches between the front of the seat and the back of the seat. And Dad then, convinced Guthrie, who was 6'8", that he always sat on the aisle and could swing his legs into the aisle, but most people didn't have that luxury. And so just ongoing fight after fight after fight. But the great fight really was the seats. And maybe, Sharon, I can't remember. Yeah, all right. You can't see this because it's black and white, but if you were to see a full color version of the Guthrie, and this is essentially what it looked like when it was finally built, was reds and blues and yellows. I mean, just this confetti-like set of colors. But again, remember, Guthrie wanted benches, right? And so Dad brought this color palette in. We still have the color palette. I don't know if that's come to Cranbrook, but it's a great thing with all of the color palette. And Guthrie just got apoplectic. He said, "Are you out of your mind? No way. We're not going to do colored seats." And he said, "Why?" He said, "Because it competes with the stage. Nothing should compete with the stage." And Dad pointed out that people wear blues and reds in the audience. I mean, what's the difference? And Guthrie would just have none of it. He completely vetoed it, said no way, no how. He relented on the 36 inches as opposed to 31 inches. He actually permitted people to have cushioned backs, but he would not give up on the seats. So this is a very big deal. This is going to be the first repertory company, regional repertory company in the United States. And so it was opening on a Wednesday, and Hume Cronin and Jessica Tandy were going to open in the Miser, and then the next day they were going to have this huge opening with a guy named George Grizzard and Hamlet. It was a very big deal. I mean, Le Monde came, New York Times came. I mean, it was just a huge deal. And so on Sunday, Guthrie calls Dad and says, "So where are the seats?" He said, "Oh, they're coming. Don't worry. It's fine." And so, yeah, again, big deal. Wednesday opening, right? Big deal. They had been doing dress rehearsals with no seats, but, Monday, no seats. Tuesday, the truck pulls up, and Dad goes to meet the truck, and Guthrie just zooms out to, he's got to get these seats in, and he opens them up. Reds and blues and greens. Dad said, "I have never been so afraid of being killed." He said Guthrie literally would have killed me if he hadn't been restrained by his keepers. And it was really something. The innovations of this theater just go on and on and on. The acoustic clouds were developed by using light. This is all before computers, of course, 1963, 64. Were all developed by creating a model, an exact model, and shining light and trying to figure out how the light moved through the space in order to figure out how the sound would work. It's a 1,432 person theater, and no one is particularly far from the stage. It really was sort of this genius of balcony overhangs and asymmetrical stage. And the asymmetrical stage is a whole long story, but essentially for years and years, a woman named Tanya Moisevich, who was a great theater designer, claimed that she had designed the stage. I'm here to tell you that is false. Because what Dad would do with Guthrie is that Guthrie would recite passages from Richard III. And he would show Dad how long it took to get through a passage into where there was a logical break. And they walk the stage and they would tape measure it. And so the asymmetry of the stage had to do with Guthrie and Dad sort of figuring out how an actor would actually use the stage. At the end of the day, it was sort of a meeting of these titans. Guthrie, in his autobiography, just takes Dad apart, just says he was strong-willed and stubborn, and yet all of the sort of the signature elements of this theater ended up staying in place. Can you cycle back just a little bit, Sharon, just to show a facade? Because one of the great innovations of this was this. What Dad called a mask. He thought as a theater it should have sort of a mask quality, and the plays of light into the theater because of this facade were just extraordinary. It was just beautiful. But it was done sort of on the cheap, and I think it was I can't remember what kind of water damage they had. It began to deteriorate, and after probably about 18 years, it began to deteriorate, and they had to actually take the facade down, which is too bad. This was also a battle that I shouldn't have gotten involved with, but I did. I got into a big fight with the Walker Arts Center, who actually owns the property, because when they built their new addition at the Walker to the great Barnes structure they have, they proposed to tear this down. And I tried to make the case that not only was this an architectural icon, it was a cultural icon. This was a coming of age for the city of Minneapolis, and it took its role as one of the most important theater centers in America. But I probably should stay out of these fights because I end up losing them, and they also tore this down. The Guthrie moved to the river, where they now have an extraordinary sort of three-stage complex. One of the interesting pieces, and if you could go forward to there, that's fine. The theater architect for Jean Nouveau came, Novell, how do you say his name? Novell, came, and he brought it was while this was still standing. He brought his theater designer in, and his theater designer basically said, there is no way I'm going to take someone else's design for my theater in the new space, because there was going to be a proscenium, a thrust, and a black box. And the thrust, we're going to do ourselves. We're not going to do it. After he walked through that, he evidently turned to Novell and said, I can't do anything better than that. We'll just copy it. And so as hard as it was for Dad to see his building torn down, when they rebuilt the Guthrie on the River in Minneapolis, the thrust stage looks exactly like that. You would walk in, and it's a few, I think they took off one end, I think they took off one row of seats just because they didn't want the full wraparound. The seats way over on your right were not always the greatest view, but all of the others held. So same acoustical clouds, same overhang balconies, same entryways, same thrust, same everything. And Dad actually, I think Toby, I don't know if you were, I think you were there. Toby and Dad and I walked through it, and he was genuinely moved that they had so meticulously recreated this. The outside, the lobby space, not so great, but the interior of the theater, quite great. And after that, he was sought after, as you might imagine, for all sorts of theater projects. This is the University of Minnesota's Rarig Center. He did the Performing Arts Complex at the University of California, Santa Cruz. But the thing that probably reflected Dad going back most fully to that 1938 4x16 project was the next structure he built, which is his home, his glass home in Wisconsin, which is now belongs to Toby and his family. This is a perfect cube, 24 by 24 by 24. The floors are suspended from the ceiling so that you're not pounding nails into glass, which is a good thing. And you can see there's just sort of the simplicity of this 24-foot square is really quite lovely. I mean, it's shifted over the years. The foundations are settling. The doors are hard to open and close, but it's still a remarkable thing, kind of sits on a bluff overlooking the Apple River in Wisconsin. And I think in many ways, this was Dad's most gratifying piece of work. He ended up spending long hours there, and he and Mom would spend, weeks at a time out there. He just loved it. So it was a sort of a fitting final body of work. He obviously did more work after this, but in many ways, I thought this was a nice place to close. So that is the story of what I think is just a phenomenal career, and Cranbrook shaped it in every possible way. Thank you for sitting quite so long. I really appreciate it.
Because we want some of you to see the drawings that are in the archives reading room. And Rip, if maybe you'll join people down there.
Sure.
It'll be an opportunity for you to ask some questions of Rip while you're also looking at more of the drawings. So with that, thank you, and we'll join you in the archives reading room.
Thank you very much.